Okay, count to 5 and then you're on.
Good morning and welcome
have a little
to
bit of glare.
the Candidates for Mayor event. I'm Dr. Tatiana Kissen, Professor of Government. This event is hosted by the Civic Engagement team that focuses on advancing students and communities' knowledge about elections, elected officials, democracy, and political institutions. Today, we are honored to speak with Daniel Caldwell, who's a candidate for mayor of the city of Fort Worth. He's an engineer and an educator. With me today is also student Juan Carmona Paez. He's the president of the Student Government Association at South Campus, who will be asking questions. Angela Morse will be posting information in the chat about early voting and polling places. If there's time left over, we will turn to asking those questions submitted by attendees in the chat. So welcome, Daniel Caldwell, and thank you for being here with us today here at Tarrant County College.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Juan for the questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kissen. And we'll get started with the first question, which is, what challenges must be overcome to achieve your vision for the city of Fort Worth?
Well, I know that the starting place for working with the city staff to have them execute the ideas I have is, first off, going to be communicating with city staff. In many bureaucratic organizations, they have what are, relatively speaking, information silos and isolation of information where you have to get approvals simply to post notices. And so the first thing is simply improving and opening communication channels with the city employees and staff members that I'll have to work with. The second major priority after improving communication with between myself and residents with the city employees in order to make sure that city services are being provided in a efficient and effective manner, both in terms of time and quality. After that comes budget. I know that if you have an unlimited amount of money, you can really accomplish anything. But if, in this case, our taxes are what provide the funding for all city services, and that provides the counterbalance of, I don't want to raise taxes. So the challenge of finding places where expenditures can be reduced or eliminated would be one of those areas where engineering comes into play in identifying how much redundancy is actually optimal. Does that make sense? So first, communication, and second, budgeting are going to be the most readily identifiable challenges. The third one is working against the grain of existing ordinances that I would like to amend, change, to improve, and against the grain of the procedures that are already routine for many of the city staff, that in order to make any improvements, there's always some kind of resistance to change. And so that resistance of inertia, nobody automatically accepts change. That would be, I guess, the third challenge.
Okay, thank you. We'll go with the second question. In light of skyrocketing property values, what ideas do you have to keep property taxes reasonable so that people are not priced out of their homes?
We have an appraisal system that largely appraises properties based not just on that property itself, but on improvements to the neighborhood around it. I would like to put in a local ordinance that says that for the calculation of taxes, we should use the appraisal at that for the value of the property at the time of the most recent change in occupancy, change in ownership, or improvement on the property, so that although we can charge under state law a higher tax and appraise the value of the property as being higher, we can also elect not to, so long as we have a fair, reasonably uniform method for determining what that value of the property should be. And so it would be the value of the property at the time of the last improvement, change of occupancy, or change in ownership. So that if you're a landlord and you have a change in tenants, when tenants change, then you would be subject to a new appraisal. If you sell your property, the new owner would be subject to a new appraisal, but not the person who's been living there for 20, 30 years. And so that you would not be subject to an increase in your taxes due to your neighbors getting improvements on their property unless you also get improvements on your property. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay. Thank you. We'll go on with the third question. After the new census date, the city council members will have to decide on the method in which they should redraw the districts, leaving them to an independent, nonpartisan committee, or redrawing the districts themselves. What is your stance on this redistricting issue?
I have reviewed the 10 recommendations of the redistricting task force, and I have criticized half of them as promoting gerrymandering and unethical practices in redistricting. I agree with the first criteria that districts should be approximately equal in size and that the population of the largest district shouldn't be more than 10% greater than the population of the smallest district. We have currently 9, soon to be 11 districts. That shouldn't be too hard of a feat to manage. I do believe that redistricting should be completed in compliance with the U.S. Constitution and Texas Constitution and federal and state laws, but I believe in looking at the second criteria. I'll send you the link to the page I'm looking at in the chat. That part of the second criteria doesn't rely on logical geographical boundaries. I want to stick to logical geographical boundaries. I want to stick to geometrically compact districts where you can just look at the map and have the shape of the district make sense, rather than where we have districts that are cut in half, where District 7, for example, is in West Fort Worth and North Fort Worth, but not in between. I think the philosophy of keep it simple, sweetie, works best. As far as a redistricting commission, that would be a group of unaccountable people who are just as prone to having their biases as the members of the city council. So long as we can remove the telltale signs of gerrymandering when the maps are drawn, I don't care who does it. My concern is the final outcome and not so much the who does it. I believe our districts should be geometrically compact, approximately the same size, and approximately the same number of people. I've written elsewhere my criticisms that it would take me a moment to look up, and I'll be glad to do that as we move on to the next part of the discussion.
Okay, we'll go on to the fourth question, which is, Fort Worth's Race and Culture Task Force made several recommendations to the City Council on racial and ethnic inequality. From those recommendations that the City Council approved, which ones do you think are the most helpful?
I'm sorry, can you speak up? I didn't hear the first half of what you said.
Of course, I'll repeat the question. Fort Worth's Race and Culture Task Force made several recommendations to the City Council on racial and ethnic inequality. From those recommendations that the City Council approved, which ones do you think are the most helpful?
So having read the, 24 recommendations that they made, I thought that many of them were vague. I don't have all those recommendations in front of me, but I thought they were vague. I thought it would be more logical to refer to the guidelines proposed by the National League of Cities, because rather than having 24 of them, they just had 6 of them, and theirs were all specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-based. Some of the goals identified by the that were adopted in that committee report were vague or amorphous. And I understand that this is a really open-ended question, and I am looking for those 24 recommendations again. Fort Worth Race. Because there were 24 of them, as I recall. But I don't have them in front of me. I pasted into the chat, by the way, a couple sentences that I had typed up with regard to the redistricting task force. So I don't remember them all offhand, and am looking that up now, which I have the link to that, so that we can literally be on the same page. I agree with it, instituting leadership training. My approach to public engagement is not so much focused on scheduling meetings, but encouraging engagement through social media. That the city has Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube profiles, and I lived in the city basically 3 years before even knowing about that, because even though I had to go onto the city website every month, the links to those to connect with the city staff were poorly presented. So I'd like to I'd like to change how the links are presented on the city website in order to actually invite engagement. Furthermore, I proudly encourage people to participate in the Fort Worth Police Department write-in program, because the police officers are city employees, and you improve public engagement by letting residents of the community spend time with a city employee who's doing their job, which for the police is their patrols, and they're able to talk to them while they're basically getting a tour of the city and seeing how officers do their job, gaining perspective on interacting with the police, while also being able to ask any other questions they have about city services that police officers, as city employees, would likely be more familiar with than most residents, and be able to help individual residents identify programs and services that they might be interested in taking better advantage of, whether it be volunteer opportunities at the animal shelter, the food pantries, or at the rec centers with youth programs. Those are conversations that would get individuals engaged either online or in person. It's one of those ways to have a conversation where you pretty well have a 1-to-1 ratio of resident to city employee, rather than having a meeting where most of the attendees in a meeting cannot meaningfully participate because they might have 100 residents to 1 or 2 city employees. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
I'm scrolling down to look at. Okay, so these have issues to discuss in the community conversations. We recognize that there are disparities. They want civilian oversight of the police department. I'm fine with that. What I'd like to see is the only really way you can really increase the presence of minority officers is by hiring more officers. But the city has emphasized paying officers more as a higher priority than hiring more officers. And because they're not hiring a significant number of officers every year, they turn away more than 90% of applicants who pass the civil service exam, just on the fact that every officer, once they get out of the academy, is paid more than double what the average resident in Fort Worth makes. I think that the police officers should not start out at a higher starting salary than the firefighters start out. And if you end the automatic annual raise, which is more than what private sector jobs provide, private sector jobs give an annual raise of 1% to 2%, the police department have a higher automatic annual raise. I think the raises should be based on merit and promotion, rather than just time, and that we should condition the city's subsidy to many of their benefits on whether they actually live in the city. We will improve community engagement of police officers with residents by having a majority of officers who live in the city. The majority of city employees don't actually live in Fort Worth, which I think speaks very poorly of us, that most of the city employees don't want to live here. We should incentivize having them actually live here by checking their voter registration once a year and conditioning subsidy to their benefits on actual residency in the city. And that way they will both be members of the community that they police, and as well as contributing to the tax base that pays their salaries.
Okay, we'll move on with Dr. Kissen, who has some additional questions.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Caldwell. I'm looking at the time, we have 5 more minutes left. So I'm going to ask you one last question. Is there anything else you would like to share about you here with us today?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is I'm sorry I might not have had the most clear answers. I, like Steve Panat, have had speech issues that I've been working on over the past several years. But as far as being a partisan, I want to reach out to the independents, the libertarians, the Republicans, the Democrats, and the other smaller parties to approach the kind of unity that Texas hasn't really seen since Governor Alan Shivers was nominated by both the Republican and Democratic parties at the same time. I have been a delegate in 2018 and 2020 to both the Republican and Democrat state conventions. I have friends on both sides of the aisle, and I believe that focusing on our common ground will do more to benefit us individually and as a community than spending most of our time arguing over the things that we disagree about. I have lots of little changes I'd make. My emphasis is really on infrastructure and mobility. We have a lot of dead ends where we could integrate neighborhoods within the city to improve relationships between different demographics. If we literally just had a bridge to connect the northeast side to the southeast side across the Trinity River, since between, what is it, Beach and 820, there's not really much. And so if we connected, say, Carson Street with, Royal Oak, then we would have improved mobility to promote commerce. I know Heritage Trace has its own dead end that kind of separates communities, neighborhoods, and access to to be able to connect with the rest of the city. We need to focus on our identity within DFW and not just be the anti-Dallas. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you so much, Mr. Caldwell. I'm looking at the time, and it's we're almost done. We would like to say thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your willingness to serve the public. We appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Blessings to you. I'm sorry I didn't get to hear more of what y'all think a candidate should say or do, because I don't really like giving speeches. I'd rather have a conversation. I want to hear what y'all have to say. What would you have wanted me to do different or say differently?
Mr. Caldwell, if you have a website or some contact information, I'm sure our attendees would love to hear that, and we can post this to the chat. Unfortunately, our time is up, but our attendees can always email you and contact you with any additional questions and concerns that they have. And I believe Angela just posted a link here. Let's see. We'll post a link to the chat and so that you can see and our attendees can contact you. Thank you.
Most of the social media I use is on Facebook, but I also have WordPress, Instagram, Twitter.
Okay, perfect. Let me check. And I believe that I see this here. And
I encourage people to check the voter guide. Whether they do Vote 411 or Tarrant Votes or the Fort Worth Business Press, I've tried to do my due diligence in making sure that I answer everyone's questions in a timely fashion.
perfect.
Unlike some of the other candidates.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming and attending our event today. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good day.